relationship. There is disagreement among analysts on this issue, but I think there's a mountain of evidence to support this view, the view of the strength of the lobby. It's fair to say that almost everything President Obama has done during his almost 2 years in office demonstrates the profound power of the lobby to move policy in a pro-Israel direction. This phrase, to move policy in a pro-Israel direction, comes from the two scholars, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who wrote a groundbreaking book on the lobby 3 years ago and essentially broke the taboo on discussing the lobby. It's a critical phrase. It certainly doesn't mean that the lobby controls all Middle East policy. It simply means that the lobby has a profound effect on how policy is made in this area. One of the most important aspects of this impact, I think, is the state of public discourse that has formed around the Palestinian-Israeli situation over the years, actually over the decades. This is a mindset and a set of assumptions that determine how we all automatically think about Israel when we hear the name mentioned and what we all think when we hear the name Palestinians mentioned. This is a public discourse, a mindset that has been building and being shaped and being internalized for almost a century, and it is all the Zionist Israeli narrative. Public discourse has a huge impact on how any policymaker approaches the Arab-Israeli issue, and particularly the Palestinian-Israeli issue. I'm talking about every policymaker in every administration since the Zionist enterprise began promoting itself in the United States around World War I. It's important to realize that pro-Zionist activists have been working to mold U.S. opinion since well before there was in Israel, and the effort continues in Congress, in the media, in the rest of the political establishment, among the public, and at the top of the heap among key policymakers, including presidents. Policymaker thinking has been directly affected in this way. Over the years since Israel's creation, there has been a pervasive atmosphere in which Israel is simply assumed to be so close to the United States, its interests so closely intertwined with American interests, that it is accepted almost as a part of the U.S. The lobby reinforces this sentiment, maintaining it in a myriad of ways and channeling it into institutional ways of involving ordinary Americans in supporting Israel. In this atmosphere, criticism of Israel is silenced, and this silencing has a direct impact on policy formulation. It also has a longer-term, more indirect, but equally critical impact, because this is the atmosphere in which future policymakers grow up. An atmosphere of ignorance and denial in which it is virtually impossible, first of all, to learn anything about the situation, and secondly, to speak out without incurring the organized wrath of Israel's supporters. This is where Barack Obama and the United States are today, caught in an induced ignorance and blindness. I actually believe that Obama fumbled so badly on the settlement freeze issue precisely because he and his advisors are almost totally ignorant of the actual situation in Palestine, Israel. I don't believe they understand the situation on the ground in Palestine and what the occupation means for Palestinians, and they do not care. They're also basically ignorant, I think, about Israel and its objectives, particularly its objectives. Their ignorance is the work of the Israel lobby. Obama's subservience to Israel on the settlement freeze, on the appointment of officials in the U.S. government whom Israel and its supporters don't like, just ask Ambassador Freeman, on the Goldstone report about Israel's assault on Gaza last year, which the U.S. has repudiated. All this has occurred not because of U.S. imperial ambitions or because of the military-industrial complex, but purely and simply because the Israel lobby has such a powerful influence on policymaking. I don't need to tell this audience how very dismal is the U.S. image throughout the Arab and the Muslim world because of our unquestioning support for everything Israel does. The tragedy of the present situation is that the United States and all U.S. politicians appear trapped in a web that they do not even recognize, in a mindset that dominates both political parties in the United States, and a web that is in which it is impossible to separate U.S. from Israeli ambitions. This perceived convergence of interests has a profound effect on U.S. policy choices in the Middle East, and I believe we are seeing this all too clearly as President Obama attempts, always unsuccessfully, to induce Israel to work toward a peace agreement. Commentators and former policymakers are using some very damning language, almost unprecedented, another use of that word, to describe Obama's handling of Netanyahu. Strong words like humiliating, pandering, pathetic. That came from a former policymaker. If the United States is unable to do better than this and unable to distinguish its own real needs from those of another state, then it simply cannot say that it acts in its own best interests. In the face of the massive human rights violations being committed against Palestinians today, the failure to recognize this reality is extremely dangerous. Ambassador Freeman told us yesterday that there will never be a peace agreement until there is a reversal of policy. Unfortunately, I'm afraid he's right, and I don't see it coming. If I could have just one more minute, I want to cite an example that sort of captures everything I've been saying. Last night, Barbara and I were in the line, the food line at the Iraqi embassy, and there were a group of midshipmen behind us, and we got talking to one, and he said that they had all been, or he anyway, had been with a group of 30 cadets from the 3 military academies on a trip to Israel last summer. And I said, did you go to Palestine? Did you go to the West Bank? And he said, no, the Israelis wouldn't allow it. Apparently they went into the West Bank on a bus, but they were not allowed to get off. And I would guess they didn't go very deeply into the West Bank. To me, this speaks to the power imbalance, because Israel has the power to control what is done, what the United States does, and the United States representatives inside Palestine. It speaks to the U.S. and its penchant for going along with anything Israel desires, and it speaks to the induced ignorance that I've been talking about, because all of these cadets remain ignorant of the situation in Palestine. So, thank you very much.
Now I'd ask, with great pride, Sarah Roy to join us. Sarah, by footnote, is also a member of the ANERA Advisory Council. Sarah.
Thank you very much. I am going to devote my presentation to a discussion of what I consider to be some very important, critically important, and very damaging shifts, paradigm shifts, in the way that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is conceptualized and addressed. And in many ways, my talk follows very logically from Kathy's. Now, since 1967, when Israel conquered the territories, the various settlements that subsequently emerged have all been based on 3 key assumptions. The first is that the Palestinian refugees of 1948 would not be a primary factor in negotiations. The second, that the Arab minority in Israel, those Arabs who remained within the newly created state of Israel, would not be part of any comprehensive settlement. And 3, the only territory subject to negotiation would be the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, the 22% of pre-48 Palestine occupied in 1967, to which the PLO agreed in 1988 and thereafter. Thus, according to the post-67 settlement formula, 78% of what was pre-48 Palestine and later became the State of Israel, and more than 50% of Palestinians were minimally to be excluded from any peacemaking process. Over the last few years, Palestine's reality has been further compromised by certain critical paradigmatic shifts in the way that the conflict is conceptualized and addressed. For example, Since the beginning of Israeli occupation, there has long been an implicit and often explicit assumption or belief among Palestinians, many Israelis, and members of the international community that occupation can and will end, and that Israel's expansion into Palestinian areas stopped. For many, this was how they understood the Oslo peace process. The belief that occupation is reversible and should be reversed was largely unquestioned and uncontested, and was the catalyzing force behind many social, political, and economic initiatives. This belief that occupation and the forces that sustain it can be stopped has itself been reversed, and is powerfully illustrated in the formalization, institutionalization, and acceptance by Israel and key members of the international community of Palestinian territorial and demographic fragmentation, cantonization, and isolation. This represents a key paradigm shift in the way the conflict is understood and approached. Perhaps the most powerful illustration of occupation's power lies in the expansion of Israeli settlements and their infrastructure, and in the building of the separation barrier or wall. The effect on Palestinians, of course, has been extremely damaging. Not only have lands and the use of those lands been lost, and according to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, 42% of the West Bank is now under total Israeli control and inaccessible to Palestinians, with 21% of settlements being built on private Arab land. But Arab lands are being incorporated and consolidated into a new spatial and political order that aims to eliminate any physical separation between Israel and certain and increasing areas of the West Bank, diminishing the presence of Palestinians and precluding the emergence of any viable entity that could be called a Palestinian state. The denial of territorial contiguity and the reality of territorial and demographic fragmentation was facilitated by the physical isolation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which was largely completed by 1998, illustrating that their separation had long been an Israeli policy goal, as argued by many analysts, including the Israeli journalist Amira Haas. Indeed, the Israeli economist Shir Haver revealed that on April 20th, 2007, in a lecture delivered at the Van Leer Institute, Brigadier General Yair Golan, then commander of Israeli forces in the West Bank, stated that, quote, separation and not security is the main reason for building the wall of separation, and that security could have been achieved more effectively and more cheaply through other means, end quote. This points to another important paradigm shift. Prior to Oslo, there was a belief among Israelis and within the international community generally that peace and occupation were incompatible. The former could not be achieved in the presence of the latter, and this too has changed. In recent years, more and more Israelis are benefiting from occupation. Their lives have been facilitated by the vast settlement road network built in the West Bank and by an improved economy. Settlements are now regarded as natural outgrowth, a needed constituency providing protection and security with important familial links to Israel proper. Thus, the integration of the settlement blocks and their infrastructure into Israel, that is, the argument that the West Bank or parts of it belong to Israel, is no longer extraordinary or contentious. On the contrary, it is necessary and normal. According to a recent poll carried out by the War and Peace Index, 2/3 of Israelis support a total or partial resumption of settlement building in the West Bank. 47% object to the evacuation of all West Bank settlements in favor of an agreement with Palestinians, and 66% support the establishment of a Palestinian state on 1967 borders with land swaps allowing Israel to keep large settlement blocks. Hence, for many, if not most Israelis and several key international donors, primarily among them the United States, it is no longer a question of normalizing the occupation, but of removing the term altogether, since it no longer applies, especially in light of a strong and expanding Israeli economy and the virtual cessation of suicide attacks inside Israel over the last few years. In a March 2010 poll, only 8% of Israeli Jews named the conflict with Palestinians as the most urgent problem facing Israel, putting it 5th behind education, crime, national